3.1 World Watch Quiz 1.
UN experts estimate that the total number of children in the world will remain at around 2 billion throughout this century. After a long period of constant increase, this peak level was reached at the end of the 20th century, as the average global fertility rate dropped from 5 babies per woman in 1950 to 2.5 in 2000.
2.
Tragically, 7 million of the 135 million children born each year die before the age of 5. But the good news is that this is a huge drop to 1 in 20. This will not cause faster population growth, as women are more likely to limit the size of their families when child mortality drops.
3.
The average life expectancy globally is 70 years. As recently as 50 years ago, it was 60, and most of the longer lives were being lived in developed countries. Today, the average of 70 years applies to the majority of the world's population.
4.
Today, 80% of adults in the world are literate. The biggest recent improvements in education have taken place for girls. In poorer countries such as Bangladesh, there are now as many girls attending primary and secondary schools as boys.
5.
A family in extreme poverty cannot be sure of having enough food to eat on a daily basis. Figures from the World Bank show that the number of people living in extreme poverty has fallen from 2 billion in 1980 to just over 1 billion today.
6.
In surveys over recent decades, self-assessment of where people feel they are on the happiness scale has resulted in slightly lower scores than half a century ago, despite significant increases in living standards.
7.
During the first 12 years of this century, the average level of debt per adult increased by 45%. In some countries, the UK, for example, it doubled.
8.
The richest 10% in the world own 86% of global wealth. At the top of the pyramid, the concentration of wealth increases further, with the top 1% owning just over 50% of global assets.
3.2
Hello, welcome again to Money Matters. Now, we've had a few emails from listeners asking us to discuss the topic of economic growth. Margaret Bentley from Surrey writes, "It's disappointing to hear the economy has grown less than expected. But why do economies need to keep on growing?" And David Adams from Newcastle says, "Politicians are always promising to get the economy back to normal growth rates. But surely our economy can't carry on growing forever." Well, I'm pleased to say we've got two people in today who are well placed to discuss this issue. Tony Adams is head of the Centre for Economic Policy.
Hello.
And Helen Armitage works for a think tank called Alternative Economies.
Hello.
Tony, can you make the case for economic growth?
Well, basically just to maintain current living standards, the economy has to grow as fast as the population. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't keep up, there isn't enough work for everyone, and that means rising unemployment. But we want to keep improving living standards, not just maintain them, especially for the poorest in society. And the only way we can lift people out of poverty is through economic growth.
That's not strictly true, though, is it? Politicians want economic growth because it allows them to say they'll make the poor richer without having to make the rich any poorer. Without economic growth, we have to start looking at the issue of income redistribution, letting the poor have a bigger slice of the cake. Of course, the people at the top are keen to avoid that, so they just keep trying to make the cake bigger and bigger.
Right. Would you agree that growth is a way to avoid doing anything about inequality, Tony?
Well, of course we need to avoid wealth redistribution if it means higher taxes on the rich. That reduces their motivation to invest, and so the economy then grows even less. Mm-hmm. We need to give everyone in society the opportunity to be better off. And that's what economic growth makes possible.
Isn't that true, Helen? That growth keeps everyone happy?
You mean a rising tide lifts all boats? That's such a familiar idea, along with the famous trickle-down effect. But growth in recent decades hasn't reduced inequality, it's made it worse. Statistics show that the poorest in society haven't benefited. The tide seems to have lifted only the big yachts, not all the boats.
Well, it certainly made a huge difference in developing countries. The gap between rich and poor countries is much smaller than it used to be. Most of the world's population now live in middle-income countries.
Yes, but the inequality within countries has continued to increase. And anyway, it's wrong to assume that economic growth automatically leads to greater happiness. That may be true for the very poor. When you really don't have enough, more is definitely good. But overall, we've seen our economies grow 24 times bigger in the last century, and we're beginning to realise it hasn't made us that much happier. Studies show that at a certain level of income, the connection between more income and greater happiness disappears.
Yes, I've heard that. And it starts to happen at a surprisingly modest level of income, too.
But you're arguing against basic human psychology here. People always want more. They always have, they always will.
Yes.
Huh? You see lots of relatively well-off people doing the lottery. Why is that?
Because they can't help thinking that buying more stuff will make them feel happier. It's what our society encourages us to believe. Just look at all the adverts on TV. But if we stop to think about what gives us greatest fulfillment, does it always involve consumption? If you want to see what really makes you feel happier, go for a long walk in the countryside with a friend. Try watching a sunset one day this week. Organise a ball game with some friends in the park.
Yeah, it all sounds very nice, but people won't stop wanting to buy more gadgets that will make their lives easier and more fun.
Do gadgets really do that, though?
3.3 Limits to Growth Part 2.
So, Helen, are you saying that we need to have less growth or no growth at all?
Well, the idea of endless economic growth is obviously a delusion. Economic growth of 2.5% a year sounds modest, but it means that GDP has to double every 30 years or so. You can't keep doing that forever. It's common sense.
Common sense told us we couldn't carry on growing as much as we have in the last 50 years. That's because we couldn't have predicted the technological advances that have made it possible. And who knows what technology we might develop in the future.
And you think, Tony, that will solve the problem of limited resources?
Well, yes, I do. We keep finding ways to use energy and resources more efficiently. Refrigerators now use half the energy they did 35 years ago. Family cars use half the fuel they did in the 1970s.
Fine, but we can't expect to keep making such huge improvements in efficiency. Our resources will remain limited, and that makes the idea of eternal growth a form of insanity. Look at those images of the Earth from space, and it becomes blindingly obvious. The last year that the global economy was at a level the planet could support was 1983. We're now exceeding that capacity by more than 30%.
Yeah, well, I remain an optimist. What's the alternative? No growth means more unemployment and less social spending because of lower tax revenues. And if the environment needs protecting, no growth means having less money to spend on doing that.
Yes. Well, perhaps you should say something about the alternative, Helen.
The alternative is the steady-state economy. And even the great-grandfather of capitalism, Adam Smith, talked about it. He thought that once everyone had reached a reasonable standard of living, our economies would stop growing and reach a steady state. He assumed people would then prefer to spend more of their time on non-economic activities, things like art and leisure and child-rearing.
Yeah, well, good luck with that. It's the happily unemployed fantasy. Fine until you need some money to do something nice with your family.
No, it doesn't mean being unemployed. There would be less work available, but it can be shared out, so we all do fewer hours a week. And as I said, the extra time can bring us much greater happiness.
But people would have much less income.
Yes, but that's not such a problem if people accept they'll have to consume a lot less anyway. We could still buy new stuff, but we'd have to get used to buying a lot less of it and keeping it for longer. It means getting things repaired more instead of throwing them away and getting a new one. That's the way we used to live not so very long ago.
Well, I just can't see it, personally.
Well, I can, so maybe I'm the optimist. And I think it's interesting to ask ourselves what we really want from life. Why are we hooked on producing and buying so much needless stuff? Why do we fill our lives with so much work that we don't have time to enjoy them? It's not as if we ever meant to create such a stressful way of life. So now's the time to look at doing things differently.
You see managing without economic growth as a positive challenge, then?
Yes. We can't go back to the growth rates of recent decades, but it needn't be a depressing prospect. Exploring the alternatives can be exciting. We just need to give up the idea that consumerism is the central purpose of life.
Well, thank you both. That is definitely an issue that isn't going to go away.
3.4. Spending on new cars.
Spending on new cars rises sharply when people are in their 20s and presumably starting work. There's then a slight fall until midlife, when there is a steady increase in people in their 40s and 50s buying new cars, perhaps men having their midlife crisis. Spending then drops back again to level off for 70-year-olds, before plunging sharply after people turn 80, when people are probably not so bothered about what they drive, if they're still driving at all.
3.5. The popularity of the name Maria.
The name Maria was reasonably popular in the 1880s, with just under 1,000 babies per million being given it. In the 1890s, its popularity rose steadily to just below 1,500. And between the 1900s and 1920s, it soared to over 2,500, before dropping again to around 2,000 in 1940. The popularity of the name fluctuated over the next 5 decades, going up to 2,800 in 1960 and dropping again to 2,000 in 1980. There was then a sharp increase, up to over 3,000 between 1980 and 1990. There was a slight decrease to 3,000 during the 1990s, and the number of babies given the name Maria then plunged back to 2,000 by the end of the first decade of the 21st century. It is currently ranked as the 92nd most popular name for girls.
3.6. Phrasal verbs with up and down. 1.
This music's great, isn't it?
Turn it up. I can't hear it.
2.
Kids, quieten down.
Oh, Jeff, let them be. They're just letting off steam.
3.
Why aren't you going out much these days?
I need to save up for a car.
4.
What's happened since your company got taken over?
They've cut down my hours.
5.
Speed up. It's a 70-mile-an-hour zone.
It isn't. You can only do 60 on this road.
6.
Slow down. My legs are tired.
We'll never get to the youth hostel before dark if we don't get a move on.
3.7. Phrasal verbs with up and down. 1,
What will you do if you get made redundant?
I'll set up my own business.
2,
What happened after the scandal broke?
The president stood down.
3,
It's such a lovely day. What shall we do this afternoon?
Let's fire up the barbecue.
4,
What effect did it have on you, having to spend so much time abroad?
My marriage broke down.
5,
My laptop's so slow to boot up.
Try uninstalling programs that you never use.
6,
The chemists shut down.
I'm not surprised. It always seemed empty.
3.8. Up and down. 1,
I'm not talking to you until you say sorry.
Oh, grow up and stop acting like a child.
2,
I don't know why Diana hasn't replied to any of my texts this week.
Oh, you need to wake up and smell the coffee. It's obvious she isn't interested in you anymore.
3,
I've been ill, but I couldn't take much time off work.
You do look a bit run down.
4,
Thank you all for coming in your lunch break. I want to talk to you about the...
Speak up! We can't hear at the back.
5,
I'm going to lose again. It's so depressing.
Oh, lighten up, will you? It's just a game.
6,
How did you manage to drop my tablet? Oh no, the screen is all cracked.
Calm down. I'll pay for the repair.
7,
Have you worked out what 4 across is? It's one of the best crossword clues ever.
It's too difficult. I give up. What's the answer?
8,
You promised you would get this report done by today.
I know. I'm sorry. I've let you down.
9,
I just don't want to confront her about it. I'm scared of her.
Man up, Tim, and stop being a wimp.
10,
Have you heard the company's been taken over? No one seems to think it will change anything much.
The management's playing it down, but it is bad news.
3.9. Workplace jargon. 1,
Going forward, we're hoping to grow the business by at least 10% over the next year.
2,
Jenny, can I task you with actioning all the points we've agreed in this meeting?
3,
This research phase is going to be mission critical on this project, so I want to make sure that everyone is following best practice.
4,
Supporting these charities will impact our tax situation positively and also get us some great publicity. It's a win-win situation.
3.10. Buzzword bingo. OK, I thought I'd touch base and bring you up to speed on our bid to win the Delco advertising campaign. I know this is on all your radars, and as you know, this is mission critical in terms of our attempt to grow the business this year. If we're proactive on this one, and our bid is successful, it will impact our public profile in a big way and bring us serious bonuses. A win-win situation. I'm pleased to see that Jeff's team have hit the ground running on this. I don't want to drill down into the ideas they've come up with so far, but let's just say they're certainly thinking outside the box, and I know Jeff will go the extra mile to get this contract. If any of you decide you've got something to bring to the table on this, give me a heads up, and I'll task you to action any good ideas you come up with. Going forward, we need to apply best practice throughout this bid, and if there are any new developments, you can be sure I'll keep you all in the loop. Danny, you don't look well. Are you feeling okay?
3.11 Sarah and Danny.
It's the macho action hero ones that get on my nerves most. Don't worry, it's on my radar. Actually no, you don't have a radar because you're not a fighter pilot. And the upcoming presentation at the sales conference isn't really a potentially mortal threat. And before you tell me this is mission critical, we sell photocopier paper and don't tend to go on many missions. There seems to be a desire to be associated with the heavy engineering boys too. My boss has started asking me to drill down when he wants me to give him more information on something. And growing the business has become incredibly common, but it still sounds odd to me. I can only think of vegetables when someone talks about growing things. Hit the ground running is all right, though. I quite like that image, because it's great when it does feel like that when you start a new project. And go the extra mile is something I often do for my customers, and I'm fine with it being described like that. Things like that and bring you up to speed sound like perfectly normal language to me. The danger with all of them is that if you hear someone say exactly the same thing many, many times, you switch off.
I can't stand all this verbing of nouns. Could you action this for me? As if, could you do this for me doesn't sound impressive enough. At least it's short, though. The ones that use an excessive number of words annoy me most. I'll keep you in the loop. Why not just keep you informed? Going forward is redundant most of the time, or you could just say in future. The only reason for using all this gobbledygook is the pathetic idea that it makes you sound like some high-flying managerial hotshot, but it can actually make you sound like a moron if you use too much of it. Some of the shorter ones can be useful. Best practice means what it says and is neat, and proactive is a good thing to be in business. I think a win-win situation has a really good feel to it, and I'm actually okay with think outside the box, because in itself it means something that I really like to do. It's just been overused so much, and the kind of person who uses it is usually stuck inside a box labelled I copy what everyone else says.